Welcome to the Grazing Grass Podcast, episode 115. You're listening to the Grazing Grass Podcast, sharing information and stories of grass-based livestock production utilizing regenerative practices. I'm your host, Cal Hardage. You're growing more than grass. You're growing a healthier ecosystem to help your cattle thrive in their environment. You're growing your livelihood by increasing your carrying capacity and reducing your operating cost. You're growing stronger communities and a legacy to last generations. The grazing management decisions you make today impact everything from the soil beneath your feet to the community all around you. That's why the Noble Research Institute created their Essentials of Regenerative Grazing course to teach ranchers like you easy-to-follow techniques to quickly assess your forage production and infrastructure capacity in order to begin grazing more efficiently. Together, they can help you grow not only a healthier operation, but a legacy that lasts. Learn more on their website at noble.org/grazing. It's noble.org/grazing. For today's episode, we are going to discuss livestock coat color. I find the color of livestock and genetics to be fascinating, so we're going to discuss that today. We're going to discuss the basis of genetics, a little bit about pigments and the genes responsible. Then we'll move on to cattle, goats, sheep, and hogs. We will not touch on poultry as it's a whole different world, and we won't discuss horse colors as I'm not familiar with the genetics of it. It will take us a few episodes. The main source utilized for today's episode is the 2021 book, Practical Color Genetics for Livestock Breeders by Dr. Spangenberg. He's done a lot of work with color genetics as well as breed conservation. If you look him up, it's very fascinating. He's done a lot of work for the Livestock Conservatory. First off, why color? Color is important to livestock breeders. Many established breeds have a specific color or pattern that helps to identify them. For example, Angus are black, Red Pole are red, and Holsteins are black and white spotted most of the time. This was one way early breeders differentiated their breed or their cattle from another's. However, in the current cattle industry, they've been breeding cows to look more similar. So now we have a lot of breeds that there's a black version or even a red version when there didn't used to be. Limousin used to just be red. Now we have black Limousin. Simmental used to be more of a yellow, orange, red spotted cow. And now breeders have worked towards having a solid black or solid red, a lot of times a blaze face on Simmental, to get that coloration that the cattle industry here wants. We even have black Herefords, which is crazy in my mind. Sorry if you breed those. And there are red Charolais. Now, obviously those are just a few examples, but there's been lots more that people's bred those colors in. Why that can happen in the breeds we have in the U.S., a lot of the breed associations have breed up programs where you can take a commercial animal, made it to a full blood or registered purebred, and slowly work that percentage up until it's high enough to qualify as a purebred on its own. And in doing so, with careful management of that, you can make some of those genes, such as color genes that's highly visible, carry on and get into that purebred where it didn't used to be. Now, there's an argument of full bloods versus purebreds. A lot of times I think purebreds hold a lot of promise there, but I know when I look at Limousin, red Limousins, I do not see any black Limousins, and there's a lot of people going to disagree with me, but where I live, I don't see black Limousins with the muscling that I see on red Limousin. Now, I'm sure there's isolated cases where that's not true, and I'm sure there's herds that's not true, but I see that a lot. Now, with the cattle industry and the way they've really placed a premium on black animals, We don't see that with the other livestock industries as much. Granted, poultry and hogs, they're breeding for those white animals in the commercial setting. But it's not as widespread as what's happened in the cattle industry. At least in my viewpoint, it's not. When discussing colors, there's two pigments that come in play. We have eumelanin, which is black when it's unmodified, and pheomelanin, which is a tan. One thing with the eumelanin is that you get an animal that's very consistently that color. Now with the pheomelanin, you get a tan, but it can vary from cream to a very dark brown, and it can vary on the animal. So you get some variation there. And to be honest, instead of saying big words that this Okie has trouble with, we're going to call those, we have the black pigment and the tan pigment. And we're not going to go into the mechanism behind that. However, if you find that fascinating, Dr. Spangenberg has a great discussion of it in his book that I'll leave a link to in the show notes. But he gets into it really deep. For our discussions, I'll refer to them as black pigment and tan pigment. Now, when we're discussing genes, we're talking about genes that occur on chromosomes. And all animals have chromosomes. And they occur in pairs. For example, humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes or 46 chromosomes. Cattle and goats each have 30 pair or 60 chromosomes. Sheep have 54 chromosomes while hogs have 38 chromosomes. And when we get an animal, it gets half its chromosomes from its father and half from its mother. So they get one version from their mother, one version from their father. While it's half each time, it's a random assortment for each animal. That's the reason you can have full siblings that look different from each other. Thus, half the genes are from its mother and half from its father. The genes located on a chromosome pair are usually referred to as the gene's locus, or in the case of multiple genes, we might say the gene's loci. The locus is basically the address to where we find that gene. And since chromosomes occur in pairs, there's two spots for a gene. On the first version of that pair and the second version of that pair. So there's two genes. And the version of that gene that's on a locus is called an allele. And if two alleles are the same, then we have a homozygous animal. So for example, if in the locus for black, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, if they have the black allele in both places, then that animal is homozygous for black. And if they're different, we call it heterozygous. If they have a black allele in one spot and maybe a red allele in another spot. For livestock color, there are a few loci which are important to determine color. The great thing about color, it's easily observed, and it's fairly discreet when you're looking at how one genotype is displayed versus another genotype. And I say fairly discreet. It's not totally, but it's enough to make color more easily identified and studied than if we were talking about the fertility of an animal or their average daily gain. And when we're looking at an animal, what we are seeing is called the phenotype. A while ago I mentioned the genotype. The genotype is actually the genetics behind the color. So phenotype is what we're looking at. Genotype is what's on the genes. And as you will see later, we can sometimes predict the genotype from the phenotype, but we can't always figure out all of the genotype. To start, there's two main loci for color. One is the extension locus, and the other is the agouti locus. The extension locus is the main one we use in cattle, while agouti locus is predominant one in goats. I say one is the predominant one. Both are important for our common colors, and we will discuss that more. But agouti is not as important in cattle. Extension's not as important in goats. With the extension locus, livestock may have more, but they will have at least 3 alleles. So we have black, wild type, and red. Those are the 3 alleles for the extension locus. With the black allele being the dominant allele, and an animal carrying at least 1 black allele will be black. And then for red is the recessive allele in the extension locus. And for an animal to be red through the extension locus, the animal must carry 2 copies of the red allele. Thus, if we have a red animal with a red phenotype, we can also make the assumption that animal is homozygous red genotype, because the only way to get a red animal in our example right now is through carrying 2 red alleles at the extension locus. However, on the other hand, if we have a black animal, we can say that animal's a black phenotype, but we can't say exactly what's in the genotype. So we know it has at least 1 allele that's black, but on the other allele, we don't know. It could be another black, which would make it homozygous black. It could be a wild type, which would make it heterozygous black, a wild type carrier. Or it could be a red allele, so then we have a heterozygous black animal that is often referred to as a red carrier. And before we get too far on this, black and red in goats is a different mechanism, usually. And we'll talk about that when we get to goats. So we've talked about black allele and red allele. The third allele is the wild type allele, which is often referred to as brown in cattle. In goats and sheep, it's a bigger range of colors and patterns. In cattle, we have, I hate to say a narrow set, but much fewer alleles there. When an animal is black or red, whatever's in the agouti locus is hidden, so it doesn't make any difference. If we have an animal that says it should be brindle in the agouti locus, if that animal says it's black in the extension locus or the red in the extension locus, it doesn't matter because that brindle will not show through. And I'm using brindle as an example, and I know there'll be some people in my comments. There's some cases where brindle shows through, but we won't get into that right now. We'll talk about that later on. If we have an animal showing wild type, which is brown, we are seeing what it shows what's in the agouti locus. And in the agouti locus, there are a few alleles for each species. I want to say cattle have about 6, goats and sheep have almost 30. So there's a lot happening there. Before we get to agouti locus, back to the extension, if we have an animal that's wild type, that the geno or the phenotype, we have an animal that's wild type and phenotype. So that means they're that brown. We do not know if the second allele there is wild type or red. We do know it's not black because if it was a black allele, the animal would be black. Animal that's brown can be homozygous for wild type, or it can be heterozygous for wild type and a red carrier. A while ago I mentioned how goats and sheep have tons of different alleles in the agouti locus, and cattle have 6, hogs only have 3. It's important to remember at any point, an animal can only have 2 alleles that they carry because they've got that 1 pair of genes or 2 chromosomes with that gene loci or locus on it. So no matter what, or no matter how many alleles there is, an animal can only have 2 versions of that gene on a chromosome. And when we think about black and red at the extension locus, the animal is predominantly a solid-colored animal, but with the agouti locus, the animal usually displays a pattern of black and tan. And you'll notice that when you think about in cattle, our black animals, they're usually solid black. red animals, and I say solid black, uniformly red. We'll get into some white spotting in a little bit. Then for animals that are wild type, they're what we call brown. And a lot of times they'll be darker on the front part of them than the back part. They'll darken as they age. Males are often a darker color than females. And their color can vary from really light colored to fairly dark. When a cow is displaying wild type, whatever's in agouti shows through. And that's usually some kind of black and tan pattern. It's not as noticeable in cattle because you do have a little bit darker on the front and it goes back, but it's very noticeable in goats. And when I say black and tan, those pigments, the final color will depend if there's some other modifiers present. Just to summarize up to this point, we have two main color genetics for livestock species. They're the extension locus and the agouti locus. The other loci we can consider as modifiers to the color determined by extension and agouti. The types of these modifiers, there's a few different types. There's the brown, there's dilutes, there's albino, and white spotting. So we've got 4 categories of different types of modifiers. The brown locus dilutes black to a brown or dun color. For cattle, dun and dexter cattle is usually caused by the brown locus. When we talk about goats, there's a few different alleles there. For the dilutes, they are common in hogs, common in cattle, but we don't see them as much in sheep and goats. Also, not all the loci are identified for dilutes, but inheritance has been determined for most of them. In cattle, there's a silver locus, which is home to a Charolais allele and a Simmental allele, which we will discuss more when we discuss cattle. The albino locus is another gene to modify the color of an animal and usually modifies it to white with pink or very light colored eyes. Most of the time when we're looking at our livestock species, we don't see the albino coming into play as much. Lastly, we have white spotting, which is a few loci. It also causes the most confusion when we're trying to figure out the genotype of an animal. White spotting can vary from very little to almost completely white. And when an animal's almost completely white, it is difficult to determine the base color of the animal due to the base color that's determined by the actions of the extension locus and the agouti locus. And again, with white spotting, there's a large number of alleles and also possibly a large number of loci. Now, how we're looking at it, usually we are able to group those alleles into one of 3 groups. The first group is we have white areas that are very cleanly white. They don't have any of the color hairs encroaching up on them, nothing speckled in the middle. They're a clean white. Then secondly, we may have a white area, but it's got colored hairs in it to make spots in there or flecks or speckling inside it. And then lastly is a continuation of that, and that's where we get roam areas rather than a white area. So roam, the different colored hairs are intermixed throughout. To wrap up the loci, we have extension locus, we have the agouti locus, and they really determine color and pattern with a few modifiers that include brown, dilutes, albino, and white spotting. So we're going to take those, and for today, we're going to go ahead and get started with cattle. Ken Cove Farm Fence is a proud supporter of the Grazing Grass podcast and grazers everywhere. At Ken Cove Farm Fence, they believe there's true value within the community of grazers and land stewards. The results that follow proper management and monitoring can change the very world around us. That's why Ken Cove is dedicated to providing an ever-expanding line of grazing products to make your chores easier and your land more abundant. Whether you're growing your own food on the homestead or grazing on thousands of acres, Ken Cove has everything you need to do it well. From reels to tumble wheels, polytwine to electric nets, water valves to water troughs, you'll find what you're looking for at Ken Cove. They carry brands like Speedrite, O'Brien's, Kiwi Tech, Strainrite, Job, and more. Ken Cove is proud to be part of your regenerative journey. Call them today or visit kencove.com, and be sure to follow them on social media and subscribe to the Ken Cove YouTube channel at Ken Cove Farm Fence for helpful how-to videos and new product releases. So first on cattle, let's discuss the extension locus. With cattle, we have black, wild type, and red alleles, and they're all fairly common in cattle. However, there are a few uncommon alleles, and we'll talk about those later. And because color is so closely related to breeds, we're going to talk about a few breeds and their colors. Angus is a great example of the black allele. Red poll cattle are a great example of the red allele. And let's just talk about red poll for just a second. As you recall, for a red phenotype, the animal must be homozygous for that red allele. So they've got two of those red alleles. And when you mate a red poll to a red poll, the calf will be red. There is no other possibility on color. And I say no other possibility. There's some other factors that are not very likely to come into play. And with the red allele at the extension locus, you can also get that white switch. So a lot of times you'll see a red cow with a white switch, a tail switch. I love that, but there's variations in it. Some won't have very much white showing there, but some will. So red's pretty easy. We look at the animal, we see the phenotype, and we're able to say, here's the genotype for it. However, with black, when we look at Angus and we see a black phenotype, because black is dominant, we don't know if that animal is homozygous for black. And that's really why we have red Angus. When Angus was developed as a breed, they crossed some other breeds to create it. And the breeders, actually, I want to say, and if I'm wrong, you can correct this, I think the first herd book for Angus back in Scotland, England, allowed red or black animals. Then it became Angus were black. And when you make black animals together, if you're culling the red out, you can get rid of a lot of the red alleles that's in that breed population, but it's very difficult to get to a 0%. So what would happen? People would breed a black, heterozygous black red carrier to another red carrier, not knowing they were red carriers, and they'd get a red calf. And then some people started keeping those red calves. Then they were actively breeding to get some of the red because they come from a common base or common start. It's just a matter of the color they were kept. Now, without DNA testing, it's difficult to breed out a recessive gene. You can test breed, take a bull and mate him to a few females, see what the offspring is, and you'd want to mate the females are recessive genes so that if there's any recessives, they would show up. It's time consuming and costly. So if we bred a black bull to a group of red females, red cows, if the bull is homozygous for black, then all the calves would be black. However, if that bull is heterozygous for black and carries that red gene, there'd be some red calves. Luckily, now with DNA testing, you can just get a DNA sample, pull some hair, send it off. A couple of weeks later, you can know if that bull is homozygous for black or heterozygous for black. And for the most part, if you're breeding black animal to a black animal, it's not that big a deal. But if you had a herd of red cows and you were using a black bull on them and you want to make sure that calf crop were all black, you'd want to test that bull and make sure he's homozygous black. The other thing we have going for us, our AI bulls usually have enough offspring that they know if they carry any of those recessives. However, the DNA testing is really nice. So we've talked about the red allele, like for red polled cattle, gives us that nice solid red color with a white switch. We've talked about the black allele that gives us a nice black animal like Angus. A third common allele is wild type, and wild type we often refer to as brown. So in cattle, what breed do we see that shows the wild type? There's a few. One we're going to use for our example is a Jersey. So if you think about Jersey cattle, they can be very light colored, they can be fairly dark, they can be a whole range in between, but it's typically a tan or a brown coloration. And oftentimes the bulls are a darker shade of it. So when you think of wild type coloration, that's a perfect example. So let's think about some breedings and what we would get. If we take a Jersey cow and we breed her to a homozygous black bull, we will get all black calves. However, if we take a Jersey or a wild type colored cow and we breed her to a heterozygous black bull who is a red carrier, then half the calves we get will be black, but the other half will be wild type coloration or brown. On the other hand, if we breed a Jersey cow to a red pole bull, all the calves will be brown because wild type is dominant. Wild type coloration or brown is recessive to black but dominant to red. One other thing with wild type coloration or this brown, a lot of times you'll see a white ring around the muzzle of the cow or bull. So you just look at their muzzle and they'll have a white ring around it. When you are looking at a red animal, they typically don't have that. Or if you're looking at a very dark bull and you're wondering, is that black? Is that just a really dark brown for wild type? Does it have a white ring around its nose? Black animals do not. Red animals do not. Wild type or brown animals typically do. Now, one thing I mentioned earlier with cattle or with any of the livestock species, if we have wild type as the phenotype for the animal, whatever's in the agouti locus shows through. So whatever pattern that is. And there's brindle that's available there, but there's some shades of brown, some different things, but it's not as well understood as goats or sheep. So typically you can just remember if you've got a brown animal or an animal that maybe the tan colors are reduced to a silver because of a dilute included in there, the animal will be darker towards the front and lighter towards the back. It's one way to tell that, but the actual mechanism in the agouti locus, they're still figuring out, with the exception, as I mentioned a while ago, of brindle. And brindle will show through on a wild type animal. And before we continue with the extension, so let's talk about brindle for just a second. Brindle is when you get those dark stripes on an animal, and it's used oftentimes when you do a F1 cross of Hereford to Bramer. Bramers are typically wild type. Now I say typically. There's been a lot of breeding to get some of those red or black, get those solid colors in there. But traditionally they've been a wild type color. That silver coloration with the black on the front and goes and fades lighter as you go back on the animal. That is a wild type coloration with the dilute. So that animal, wild type, is dominant to red. So if we made them to a Hereford cow, that Hereford is red at the extension locus. So then we get a calf that's wild type. Interesting enough, most Herefords carry a brindle at the agouti locus. They carry the brindle alleles at the agouti locus, and it's not displayed in a solid red animal. So then we get this offspring that's wild type, brown, and it shows what's in the agouti locus, and it says brindle. because brindle's dominant to the others. So then we have this wild type animal that's also a brindle, and that gives us those tiger stripe F1s. Very interesting how they can use those, how they can use it. It was discovered, they make that crossing, those genetics underlying there, really trademark almost those offspring animals. Continuing on with extension, there's another allele in the extension locus we haven't talked about, and then there's another gene that affects it. First, we have an allele called black red, or tail star red. And for the black red allele, it came about, it's available in Holsteins. Telstar was one of the major bulls that had this coloration. And what happens, the calf is born red, and then it turns black at a fairly young age of 3 to 6 months. And when it's born, you can't tell the red allele from the black red allele. The phenotype looks the same. Likewise, when the animals turn black, you can't tell the phenotype whether or not it's due to the black-red allele or the black allele. Now, I say that. In the animals I've looked at, I have not been able to tell. Now, I have heard people say they can tell, like on the red animal, there'll be some black hairs on it, or on the black animal, there'll be some red hairs. My experience is limited. I have had some in the past, and I was unable to tell. Now, that's been a while, and I haven't looked at any recently, so maybe you can. I'm not sure. But do know black-red is a allele in the extension locus that's not usually worried about in beef cattle, but it does occur in Holsteins. Now, on the black-red or tail star allele, it is recessive to black, but it's dominant to wild type and red. So if we think about the dominance of those different alleles, we have black, black-red, wild type, and then red. Now, there is a second gene of importance when we're talking about the extension locus. However, it's not an allele at the extension locus. It is located at another spot, and it is called dominant red, and it overrides anything in the extension allele. Dominant red gene occurred in Holsteins, and when it's present, it doesn't matter what is in the extension locus because the animal will be red. It'll be a dark red, but it'll be red. Now, let's say we have a dominant red bull and we made it to a black and white Holstein. That calf is going to be red and white because the red is dominant to black, wild type, black, red, anything in the extension locus because it hides whatever's in the extension locus. Very interesting. I do not know of that gene being outside of Holsteins at this point. I think it was discovered in the late 80s, early 90s. There's very few bulls out there that have it, but it is out there. And my understanding with this is it looks the same as recessive red. It's just a dark red. So I think that's really fascinating. And for today, we're going to wrap up our episode having covered just a little bit about the basics of genetics, the black and tan pigments, and the gene loci that are important to coloration in our livestock species. Then we were able to talk about the extension locus in cattle, as well as the agouti locus in cattle. Next week, we will continue on. We'll talk about the dilutes that really, two breeds that jump out to us, Simmental and Charolais. There's other breeds that have it and those colorations that come in. And then we'll talk about white spotting, and that'll get maybe a little confusing on the white spotting, but it's very interesting. And we'll wrap up that, and then we'll get to the other species. Also, let me know what you think about this episode. A little bit different than normal. If you have knowledge that I don't have, I don't know everything. In fact, I know very little. But if you have some information contrary to what I've said today, hey, please let me know. I'd appreciate it. Also, if you have another source for this type of information beyond Dr. Spangenberg's book, as well as some other commonly available things, I'd love to know it because I think color genetics are fascinating. Thank you for listening. And if you found something useful, please share it. Share it on your social media. Tell your friends. Get the word out about the podcast. Helps us grow. If you happen to be a grass farmer and you'd like to share about your journey, go to grazinggrass.com and click on Be Our Guest. Fill out the form and I'll be in touch. We appreciate your support by sharing our episodes and telling your friends about it. You can also support our show by buying our merch. We get a little bit back from that. Another way to support the show is by becoming a Grazing Grass Insider. Grazing Grass Insiders enjoy bonus content, monthly Zooms, and discounts. You can visit the website, grazinggrass.com, click on support, and they'll have the links there. Also, if you haven't left us a review, please do. It really helps us as people are searching for podcasts. And I was just checking them, and we do not have very many reviews for 2024. So if you haven't left us a review, please do. And until next time, keep on grazing grass.